Something just shifted, and no one saw it coming. This wasn't the kind of moment that builds slowly or gives you time to process what's happening. It hit fast, out of nowhere, and suddenly everyone was paying attention for reasons that had nothing to do with football itself. No highlights, no stat lines, no game day drama, just a few words that quietly entered the conversation and then exploded into something much bigger. At first, it looked like one of those situations that would fade out in a few hours, buried under the next headline. But instead, it did the opposite. It spread, it picked up momentum, and before anyone could stop it, people started digging deeper, asking what was really said and whether any of it could actually be trusted. What made this different wasn't just the comment, it was what people started calling it. The word falsehoods began circulating, and that changed everything. Because once something is labeled that way, it's no longer just an opinion or a misunderstanding. It becomes something heavier, something that suggests intention, as if someone crossed a line they weren't supposed to cross. And in today's world, where every statement can be clipped, reposted, and reshaped in seconds, that kind of accusation doesn't stay contained. It multiplies, it creates tension, it forces people to pick a side before the full story is even clear. And that's exactly what started happening here as confusion turned into debate, and debate quickly turned into controversy. Then, one name entered the situation, and the entire tone shifted. Shedeur Sanders wasn't the one who started this, but once he became part of it, everything escalated to another level. Because when you're in his position, nothing is ever just a small moment. Every reaction matters, every move gets analyzed, and every situation becomes bigger than it should be. But this wasn't just about attention or pressure. This felt different, because the conversation wasn't just circling around football anymore. It was drifting into something more personal, something tied to reputation, respect, and the kind of boundaries that athletes don't always talk about publicly. And that's where things took a turn no one could ignore, because this story didn't begin with Shedeur, and it didn't begin with a reaction. It started with a statement, one that pulled in another name, one that carries serious weight across the entire football world, a name that doesn't just represent success, but influence, legacy, and authority. And once that name got dragged into the conversation, everything changed instantly. The stakes got higher, the reactions got stronger, and what could have been a minor situation suddenly became something much bigger. The kind of moment where one response can shift the entire narrative, and where what happens next might matter even more than how it all started. It all started with a comment, just a few words that, on the surface, didn't seem like they would carry this kind of weight. But in today's world where everything moves fast and nothing stays private for long, even the smallest statement can turn into something massive. This one came from Seaton, and almost immediately people began paying attention, not just because of what was said, but because of who was mentioned. Because somehow, in the middle of that comment, another name entered the conversation, a name that doesn't just sit quietly in the background, a name that changes the energy of any situation the moment it's brought up: Deion Sanders. And that's when things started to shift. At first, there was confusion. People weren't even sure what the full context was. Clips started circulating, fragments of the statement appeared online, and like always, the internet began doing what it does best, filling in the gaps before the full story was even clear. Some believed the comment was being taken out of context. Others felt like there was more behind it than what was initially visible. But regardless of what people believed, one thing was certain: the situation wasn't staying quiet, it was growing, and fast. What made it even more complicated was the lack of clarity. There wasn't a single, clean version of what had been said. Instead, there were interpretations, different angles, different takes, different narratives forming at the same time. And as those narratives spread, so did the tension. Because when a statement involves someone like Deion Sanders, it doesn't just remain a casual remark. It becomes something people analyze, question, and sometimes even challenge. Every word starts to matter more. Every detail gets picked apart, and suddenly something that might have been simple turns into a full-blown discussion. Then came the turning point, the moment when the conversation stopped being about what was said and started becoming about whether it was true at all. That's when the word falsehoods began to enter the discussion. And once that happened, everything changed. Because now it wasn't just about interpretation, it was about accuracy, about credibility, about whether something had crossed a line. And once that kind of accusation is in the air, it doesn't just disappear, it sticks, it spreads, and it forces everyone involved into the spotlight, whether they wanted to be there or not. And just like that, what began as a single comment turned into something much bigger. The focus wasn't just on the words anymore, it was on the impact those words were having. People started watching closely, waiting to see what would happen next, wondering if someone would step in and respond. Because when a situation reaches this level, silence doesn't last forever. Eventually, someone speaks, and when they do, that's when everything really begins. The moment the word falsehoods entered the conversation, everything escalated. Up until that point, it was still possible to treat the situation like a misunderstanding, something taken out of context, maybe misinterpreted, maybe overblown. But calling something a falsehood changes the entire tone. It suggests that what was said wasn't just inaccurate, it was misleading, possibly even intentional. And in a space like college football, where reputation matters just as much as performance, that kind of label doesn't stay quiet for long. It spreads, it sticks, and it immediately raises the stakes for everyone involved. Almost instantly, the narrative began to shift. This wasn't just about a comment anymore. It became about credibility. People weren't just asking what was said, they were asking who's telling the truth. And that question is where things started to spiral. Because once doubt enters the conversation, it pulls everything else with it. Fans started dissecting every clip they could find, trying to piece together the original context. Analysts began weighing in, offering their own interpretations, and online, the discussion turned into a full-blown debate, with different sides forming faster than anyone could keep track of. What made it even more intense was how quickly the accusation took on a life of its own. Reports began circulating, some claiming the original statement had been twisted, others suggesting it was being downplayed. But here's where it gets complicated. None of it was completely clear. There wasn't a definitive explanation that shut everything down. Instead, there were fragments, opinions, and speculation filling the gaps. And as that uncertainty grew, so did the tension. Because in situations like this, people don't wait for clarity. They react to what's in front of them. And then came the pressure, because once falsehoods becomes the center of the conversation, someone is expected to respond. Silence starts to feel like acceptance, and that's something no one in the spotlight can afford. The focus began shifting away from the original comment and toward the people connected to it. Who was going to step in? Who was going to address it? And more importantly, how were they going to handle it? That's when all eyes turned in one direction, Shedeur Sanders. Not because he started the situation, but because of what he represents. His name carries weight, his position demands attention, and his connection to Deion Sanders makes this more than just another storyline. And as the noise grew louder, the expectation became clear. People weren't just waiting for a response, they were expecting one. Because once a situation reaches this level, it doesn't fade away on its own. It builds, it intensifies, and eventually it forces a reaction. And when that reaction finally comes, it doesn't just respond to the moment, it defines it. The response, when it finally came, wasn't quiet, and it definitely wasn't neutral. Shedeur Sanders didn't ease into it or try to carefully tiptoe around the situation. He stepped in with emotion, and you could feel it immediately. This wasn't the kind of calculated, media-trained answer people are used to hearing from quarterbacks. It felt raw, direct, and personal, like someone who had reached a point where staying silent was no longer an option. And the moment that response hit the public, everything changed again. Because this wasn't just about correcting a statement, it felt like drawing a line. The tone made it clear that from his perspective, something had gone too far. In football, players deal with criticism constantly. Performances get analyzed, decisions get questioned, and debates happen every week. That's normal. But this didn't feel like normal criticism. This felt like something that crossed into territory that doesn't get brushed off easily. And the way he responded showed that he wasn't treating it like just another headline. He was treating it like something that needed to be addressed head-on. What stood out the most wasn't just what he said, but how he said it. There was frustration there, but also a sense of urgency, like he needed to shut something down before it spread even further. It didn't come across as strategic, it came across as instinctive, and that's what made people pay attention. Because when an athlete reacts like that, it signals that the situation means more than what's visible on the surface. It tells you there's something deeper behind it, something that pushed him to respond in a way that couldn't be ignored. And then there's the obvious layer that made everything even more intense. This wasn't just about him. The conversation involved Deion Sanders, and that changes everything. Because now it's not just about handling criticism as a player, it's about protecting family, defending a name, and responding to something that feels personal in a completely different way. And when that line gets crossed, the rules shift. It's no longer just about staying composed for the cameras. It becomes about standing up for something bigger than yourself.
The impact of that response was immediate. Social media lit up, clips started circulating everywhere, and suddenly, people weren't just debating the original comment, they were dissecting his reaction. Some saw it as justified, even necessary. Others saw it as too much, too emotional, too risky for someone in his position. But no matter which side people were on, one thing was clear. The situation had reached a completely different level. Because once a response like that goes public, there's no pulling it back. And just like that, the story evolved again. What started as a questionable comment had now turned into a full-blown confrontation with emotion at the center of it. And the more people reacted to his response, the bigger it became. Because now, it wasn't just about what was said in the beginning, it was about how it was handled. And that's where things start to get complicated, because not everyone agrees on what the right response looks like, especially when emotions are involved. This is the point where the situation stopped being just another sports debate and turned into something much more personal. Because there's a clear line in football, one that players, fans, and analysts all understand. You can criticize performance, you can question decisions, break down film, and debate talent all day long. That's part of the game. But when the conversation starts involving family, when it pulls in names that carry deeper meaning, that's when everything changes. And in this case, that line didn't just get touched, it felt like it was crossed. For Shedeur Sanders, this wasn't just about defending himself or clearing up a misunderstanding. The moment Deion Sanders became part of the narrative, the situation took on a completely different weight. Because now, it wasn't just about football anymore. It was about legacy, respect, and protecting a name that means more than just wins and losses. When your father is not only your coach, but also one of the most recognizable figures in the sport, anything said about him carries extra impact. It's not distant, it's direct. And that's what made the reaction feel so different. This wasn't calculated. It wasn't just about managing public perception or staying composed under pressure. It felt instinctive, like a response driven by something deeper than the moment itself. Because when family gets involved, logic doesn't always come first, emotion does. There's a natural urge to respond, to push back, to make it clear where you stand. And in situations like this, that instinct can override everything else, even the expectations that come with being a quarterback in the spotlight. But that's also where the tension comes in. Because while one side sees it as completely justified, standing up for family, refusing to let something slide, another side sees it differently. They see the role he plays, the position he's in, and the expectations that come with it. Quarterbacks aren't just players, they're leaders, faces of programs, and symbols of composure under pressure. And when things get personal, the challenge becomes balancing that emotion with the responsibility of staying in control. That balance isn't easy, and when it tips one way or the other, people notice immediately. What makes this even more complicated is the presence of Jordan Seaton in the middle of it all. Because whether his original comments were misunderstood, taken out of context, or something else entirely, they became the spark that ignited everything. And once that spark hit a situation involving family, reputation, and a name like Deion Sanders, there was no way it was going to stay contained. It was always going to grow into something bigger. And that's exactly what happened. The focus shifted away from just the words and onto the meaning behind them, onto the emotions they triggered, onto the response they demanded. Because once something becomes personal, it stops being about facts alone. It becomes about perspective, loyalty, and how far someone is willing to go to defend what matters to them. And in this case, that shift is what turned a simple moment into a full-blown controversy that no one can ignore. The moment that response went public, the reaction wasn't just loud, it was split. Almost instantly, the entire conversation divided into two completely different perspectives, each one just as passionate as the other. On one side, you had people rallying behind Shedeur Sanders, seeing his reaction as exactly what the situation demanded. To them, this wasn't over the top or unnecessary, it was real. It was loyalty. It was someone refusing to stay silent when something felt wrong, especially when it involved Deion Sanders. In their eyes, if a line gets crossed, you don't ignore it, you respond, and you make sure your message is heard clearly. Supporters leaned into that idea hard. They argued that this is what you want from a leader, not someone who hides behind safe answers, but someone who stands up when it matters. They saw it as a sign of character, a willingness to protect not just himself, but the people around him. And in a sport built on toughness and accountability, that kind of response felt authentic to them. It wasn't polished, it wasn't filtered, it was honest. And for a lot of fans, that honesty carried more weight than how it looked from the outside.
But on the other side, a completely different narrative was building just as fast. Critics weren't necessarily defending what started the situation, they were questioning how it was handled. Their focus wasn't on the original comment as much as it was on the reaction that followed. Because from their perspective, this is exactly the kind of moment where composure matters most. As a quarterback, especially one under as much attention as Shedeur, every reaction becomes part of your image, and when emotions take over publicly, it can shift the conversation away from performance and toward controversy. Some analysts and former players began pointing out that this is part of being in the spotlight. Not every comment is fair, not every narrative is accurate, but reacting strongly to each one can create a pattern, and that pattern can become a distraction. In their view, staying calm would have sent a different kind of message, one that shows control, discipline, and focus, even when things get personal. Because in high-level football, especially at the quarterback position, leadership isn't just about what you say when things are going well, it's about how you respond when they're not. And that's where the divide really took shape. It wasn't just about right or wrong anymore. It became about perspective. One side saw emotion as strength, proof of loyalty and authenticity. The other saw restraint as strength, proof of leadership and control. Both arguments carried weight, and that's what made the situation even more intense, because there wasn't a clear answer that everyone could agree on. Meanwhile, the noise kept growing. Social media turned into a battlefield of opinions. Clips were being replayed over and over, and every angle of the situation was being analyzed in real time. Even Seaton found himself pulled deeper into the spotlight as people revisited his original words, trying to figure out where things really went off track. And as the reactions kept pouring in, one thing became clear: this wasn't slowing down anytime soon. Because once fans, players, and analysts all start weighing in at the same time, a situation like this doesn't just fade away. It evolves, it grows, and it turns into something much bigger than the moment that started it. And just when it felt like it couldn't get any louder, another layer stepped in and took control of the narrative. That's when the media stepped in, and the entire situation transformed again. Because once a story like this leaves social media and enters mainstream coverage, it stops being just a moment and starts becoming a narrative. Headlines began popping up, segments were being built around it, and suddenly the focus wasn't just on what was said or how Shedeur Sanders reacted. It shifted into something deeper, something more layered. Now the question wasn't what happened, it was, what does this say about him? And that shift is where things get serious, because in sports media, especially at the quarterback position, every situation becomes a reflection of leadership. Analysts started framing the conversation around composure, maturity, and control. They weren't just replaying the moment, they were interpreting it, breaking it down, assigning meaning to it.
Some argued that his response showed passion and loyalty, traits you can't teach. Others questioned whether it revealed something else, whether it hinted at how he handles pressure when things don't go his way. And just like that, the narrative expanded beyond the original controversy and into a full evaluation of his character. What made it even more intense is how quickly those narratives stick. Once a storyline forms in the media, it doesn't just disappear, it follows you. Every future moment starts getting viewed through the same lens. A reaction like this doesn't stay isolated. It becomes part of a larger conversation about who you are as a player and as a leader. And for someone like Shedeur, who already carries the weight of expectations tied to Deion Sanders, that kind of attention only amplifies everything. Every move feels bigger. Every decision feels more scrutinized. At the same time, the media didn't ignore the origin of all this. Seaton was pulled right back into the spotlight as analysts revisited his comments, trying to determine whether they were truly misleading or simply misunderstood. Some reports suggested the situation may have been blown out of proportion, while others leaned into the idea that it sparked a necessary response. But just like everything else in this story, there wasn't a clear consensus, only more angles, more interpretations, and more debate. And that's the power of media involvement. It doesn't just report what happened, it shapes how people understand it. It turns moments into storylines, reactions into narratives, and individuals into symbols of something bigger. What started as a single comment had now evolved into a discussion about leadership, pressure, and identity in the spotlight. And once a situation reaches that level, it's no longer controlled by the people involved, it's driven by how it's being told. Because now the story isn't just unfolding, it's being defined in real time. And the more it gets analyzed, debated, and replayed, the further it moves away from where it started. But even with all that noise, one piece of the puzzle still hasn't been fully understood, and that's where things start to get even more complicated. While most of the attention has been locked onto the reaction, there's another side to this story that hasn't been fully settled, and it revolves around Seaton. Because no matter how big the response became, none of it happens without the original comment. And the deeper people started digging, the more one thing became clear. The truth behind what he actually said isn't as straightforward as it first seemed.
There's been a lot of talk, a lot of clips, and a lot of opinions, but not a single version that everyone agrees on. Some reports suggest his words were taken out of context, that what he meant isn't what people heard once it started circulating online. Others claim the statement itself crossed a line, that it introduced something inaccurate into the conversation. And that's where the confusion really starts to build. Because in situations like this, context is everything, and once that context gets lost, the entire narrative can shift in ways no one originally intended. What makes this even more complicated is how fast social media reshapes information. A single sentence can get clipped, reposted, and interpreted a dozen different ways within minutes. And once that happens, it's almost impossible to trace it back to its original meaning. There's been a lot of buzz online suggesting that parts of Seaton's comment may have been amplified or slightly altered as they spread. But at the same time, others believe the core message remained the same. The problem is, without a clear, universally accepted version, both sides continue to exist, and both sides continue to fuel the debate. And because of that uncertainty, Seaton has found himself in a difficult position. He's now part of a story that's grown far beyond the initial moment, with people analyzing not just what he said, but what they think he meant. Was it a misunderstanding? Was it poorly worded? Or was it something that genuinely sparked the reaction we saw from Shedeur Sanders? Those questions are still floating around, and so far there hasn't been a definitive answer that shuts the door on any of them. At the same time, it's important to recognize how quickly situations like this can spiral once they hit the public. What might have started as a simple comment now carries layers of interpretation, emotion, and reaction stacked on top of it. And when that happens, the original intent often gets buried under everything that comes after. That's exactly what we're seeing here, a situation where perception has started to take over reality, where what people believe happened is becoming just as powerful as what actually did. And that leaves the entire story in a strange place, because without clarity on Seaton's side, the debate can't fully settle.
It just keeps evolving, with each new take adding another layer to the narrative. Which brings everything back to the same unresolved question. If the truth isn't completely clear, then how do you judge the reaction that followed? And that's where this situation reaches its most intense point, because the answer depends entirely on which version of the story you believe. Now it all comes down to the question that's driving this entire situation. Did Shedeur Sanders go too far? It sounds simple, but the moment you start breaking it down, it gets complicated fast. Because this isn't just about one reaction, it's about context, emotion, expectations, and everything that comes with being in his position. From one angle, his response makes complete sense. If you believe that something inaccurate was said, especially involving Deion Sanders, then stepping in becomes almost unavoidable. For a lot of people, staying silent in that moment wouldn't have been strength, it would have looked like acceptance. And in a situation that feels personal, that's not something most players are willing to risk. From that perspective, the reaction wasn't excessive, it was necessary. It was about drawing a line and making it clear that certain things won't be ignored. There's an unwritten rule in sports that players understand. Criticism of performance is fair game, but once it crosses into something deeper, the response changes. And for supporters, that's exactly what happened here. They see it as someone protecting his family, standing on principle, and refusing to let a narrative take shape without pushing back. In their eyes, that kind of response shows authenticity, not weakness. But then there's the other side of the argument, and it carries just as much weight. Because when you step into the role of a quarterback, especially one under constant attention, the expectations shift. It's not just about what you feel, it's about how you handle it publicly. Leadership at that level is often measured by composure, by the ability to stay controlled even when things get personal. And that's where critics start to question the response, not necessarily because it was wrong, but because of how it was delivered. The concern isn't the message, it's the impact. Because reactions like this don't exist in isolation. They can change the focus around a player. Instead of talking about performance, preparation, and progress, the conversation shifts to controversy. It creates noise, and in a high-pressure environment, noise can become a distraction. That's the risk. Even if the response is justified emotionally, it can still carry consequences professionally. And that's what makes this debate so difficult to settle. Both sides are looking at the same moment, but through different lenses.
Then there's the factor that complicates everything even more, the uncertainty around what actually started it. If Jordan Seaton's comments were truly misleading, then the reaction feels more understandable, maybe even expected. But if they were taken out of context or misunderstood, then the entire situation shifts again. Suddenly, it's not just about defending something, it's about reacting to something that may not have been exactly what it seemed. And that gray area is what keeps this question alive, because without clear answers, there's no clear conclusion. So the reality is, there isn't a clean yes or no here. It depends on what you value more: emotion or control, loyalty or composure, reaction or restraint. And in a moment like this, those lines blur quickly. What feels right in the moment can look different from the outside, especially when it's replayed, analyzed, and debated from every possible angle. That's why this situation hasn't settled, and why people are still arguing about it long after the initial moment passed. But here's the part that matters even more. This isn't where the story ends, because whether the reaction was right or wrong, justified or excessive, the real impact comes from what happens next. Moments like this don't just disappear. They either fade away quietly or they become something that sticks, something that follows a player and shapes how they're seen moving forward. And right now, it's still unclear which direction this one is going to take. So what happens next? That's the part no one can answer yet, and it's exactly why this moment still feels unfinished, because situations like this don't just disappear overnight, especially when they involve names like Shedeur Sanders and Deion Sanders. There's too much attention, too much pressure, and too many eyes watching every move. What started as a single comment has now turned into something much bigger, and the next steps will decide whether this fades into the background or becomes part of a much larger story. For Shedeur, this moment is more than just a reaction. It's a test, not of talent, not of performance, but of how he handles everything that comes with being in the spotlight. Because at his level, every situation like this adds to the narrative surrounding him. It shapes how people see his leadership, his mindset, and his ability to deal with pressure when things get personal. One response doesn't define a career, but patterns do, and that's why what he does next matters just as much, if not more, than what already happened. At the same time, the situation involving Jordan Seaton hasn't fully settled either. There's still no complete clarity around the original comment, and until that piece is fully understood, the debate will keep lingering. Was it misunderstood? Was it exaggerated? Or was it exactly what it sounded like? That uncertainty keeps the story alive, because without a clear answer, people continue to fill in the gaps with their own interpretations, and that's how narratives grow. Zooming out, this isn't just about one moment or one reaction. It's about the reality of playing under constant attention, where every word, every action, and every response gets amplified instantly. It's about how quickly things can escalate, how fast perception can take over reality, and how difficult it is to control a story once it starts moving. Because once something like this reaches the public, it no longer belongs to just the people involved. It belongs to everyone watching, reacting, and forming opinions in real time. And that's what makes this situation so unpredictable. It could cool off, replaced by the next headline, the next game, the next storyline. Or it could stick, becoming one of those moments people look back on as a turning point, the kind of moment that quietly shapes how a player is viewed moving forward, whether fairly or not. Right now, it's still hanging in that space between those two outcomes, and the truth is, the response was only the beginning. What comes after, that's what will define everything.